Hey guys, welcome back to Release the Craftin. Priscilla here with another book review for the Release the Craftin book club thing that I do. So if you guys don't know, if this is your first time joining in, I am doing a year-long book club sponsored by me, hosted by me, here and also on Instagram. If you would like to join, you can join at any time. It's an open book club, and I am reading a different Greek retelling every month and then talking about it. So I'm going to share my thoughts on the book of last month, which was Herc, and then let you guys know what the book for next month is going to be. And then if you want to continue the discussion, you can hop over to my Instagram, give me a shout, say hello, hey, I would like to join, and I'll add you to the group chat, and then we'll talk about the book that we read, or the book that's coming up, or anything, honestly, because I'm always down to chat. And here we are. So today we have Inky, channel mascot, and I have some water, no coffee or tea, because I am dehydrated, and it's summertime in Texas. It's not officially summer, but it's summertime. So here we are. And we're talking about Herc. This is the book by Phoenicia Rogerson. That's the book of May that I read last month. I'm on sort of a personal goal to just, do some more meaningful, impactful reading, cover all these, Greek retellings and stuff, because I work with a lot of, Greek mythology in my own personal life and my personal spiritual practices. So, it made sense. It all clicked together. So here we are. If you would like to know what the book for next month is, so you can join, I'm going to tell you guys right now. You don't have to wait till the end of the video. That's mean. We're going to do Ariadne by Jennifer Saint. So Ariadne will be the book for the month of June that we're going to read, and I will talk about it at the end of the month, and we'll do this whole thing all over again. So, next month, Ariadne, Jennifer Saint. I've said it a few times. Read this book next month. This month of previous month of May, we read Herc by Phoenicia Rogerson. And I'll tell you guys, I was on a roller coaster ride emotionally with this book. I started out being I actually hate this book. And then by the middle of it, I was okay, I found a way to look at this book and recontextualize it in a way that made it easier to read and more enjoyable. And then by the end of the book, I was wow, this is actually a really, really good book. Which is interesting, but also fun, because I don't think I've ever read a book that had me feel the entire spectrum of emotions, but this book did. I really enjoyed it. As per usual, I listened to this book on Audible, and this book in particular had a full cast. So every chapter in this book is from a different person's perspective, and so there was a different person speaking every chapter for those specific characters, and I really enjoyed that. As far as Audible audiobooks go, I really enjoyed getting to hear different voices voice different characters. It made it a lot easier to distinguish one character from the next, but also just added a lot of personality to the read that I think would have been not impossible, but a little bit harder for just one narrator to come across and cover. As far as the book goes, I really enjoyed it. I'm not going to spoil anything yet. I'll let you guys know when I drop some spoilers, so feel free to continue listening and then drop off if you don't want the book spoiled for you. But the book itself, and the reason I was on this emotional roller coaster, is that the book's entire idea is that it is the entire life of the hero known as Heracles, who in this book is called Hercules, and I'll get into that and why it irritates the life out of me in a second. But told from the perspective of everybody around Herc, and not Herc in particular. You never get his perspective on things. You get everybody else's perspective on them. And at first I was okay, this is interesting. I like the concept. It's not a big deal. But then I was this reads like a hit piece for somebody that it really just upset me. And I had a very visceral, triggered reaction to it. And I think because so much work is done by his parents and family to sort of in the beginning of the book demonstrate that he lacks social cues and is coming from sort of a different place with a different understanding of things, and everybody acknowledges that he has a different way of viewing the world and interacting with everybody else around, to the point where like he kind of reads a little bit neurodivergent, if that's how you want to read it. It's never stated that that's the case, but as a person who is neurodivergent, I picked up on a lot of those cues where I was like, okay, so he learns differently, he speaks differently, he's a little bit socially awkward and has a hard time like fitting in socially where everybody else gets along just fine. And to me, those were a lot of like little neurodivergent flags where I went, oh, okay, he's kind of like me as a person, and I can like resonate with that. And then immediately it goes from like his family, who would be more caring and understanding and empathetic towards him, to the people who encounter him on the road, and they're like, this asshole, this hassle, this hassle. And I was like, wow, that's harsh to read as a person who already like mapped themselves onto the main character, to then immediately have people be like, he was a jerk, he was like senseless, thoughtless, unfeeling, rude, horrible, awful, terrible. And you're like, oh, but he's different. He's differently abled and has a different perspective and understanding. And you tried so hard to deliver that to me in a way that made me go, oh yeah, absolutely. Like, he's a little bit off the beaten path, a little bit off of like what people might consider the norm socially and intellectually. And then you went, he's actually a jerk and he sucks and everybody hates him. And I was like, wow, this is like a hit piece for like a neurodivergent person. And it hurt. It hurt me, but also just kind of hurt to read. I was like, wow, this is so harsh and hard to deal with, to like reconcile. But then as I started to go on further into the book, I sort of came to the conclusion that, like, you know, the perspectives across the board weren't all, like, only his family loves him and everybody else is negative. There was a wild, like, a wide panoply of perspectives and opinions on Hercules. And, I was like, okay, you know what? This book actually reads like a gossip magazine where, like, everyone's just sort of chiming in with their different opinions on one person. Like, it's just like somebody collected all the gossip in the country about one person and put it together in a book. And so once I put that perspective into play, I was like, okay, let me walk back my visceral, like, reaction, where I felt like they were just sort of being mean to the neurodivergent kid. Let me walk that back a little bit and then look at it from a different perspective, where this is just everybody's gossip and hearsay and everyone's just throwing in their 2 cents into the ring, and it doesn't actually matter. Like, it matters because this is the perspective that all these different people have of him, but it doesn't matter in the sense that, like, it's not his truth or his perspective, and we never get that. So you're left to infer what you will from the things everybody else says, and it's kind of like how we view celebrity in current, like, day and age, where you hear a lot of little tiny stories about a certain celebrity from different points of view and different perspectives, and then you're left to decide how you're going to judge that celebrity's character, and it's based entirely on the things everybody else has said about them, not the things that they've said about themselves in particular, or like how they would explain those situations and stuff like that. So I was like, okay, so we're dealing with this in a sort of antiquarian, like antiquated fashion, where we're looking at an ancient Greek celebrity and how everybody else is talking about them. And some people are inclined to talk trash, and other people are going to be very favorable, and other people are going to be in the middle, where they're like, well, there's some good and there's some bad points. And it's a very fair way to look at somebody, to get an accurate portrayal of, you know, the impact that some person has on the entirety of their world, their life. So, that being said, once I started looking at it that way, I was like, okay, I actually really enjoy this. This is really enjoyable to read, because now I can take everything with a grain of salt. I can see that, like, some people's ego is coming into play, and I was able to divorce myself from, like, they're bullying the neurodivergent kid to, oh, actually, there's a whole wide range of perspectives here, and people have their own opinions on things. And this is also, like, witness, bystander sort of bias, where, you know, like, when a crime happens, you can ask every single person who watched it, and everyone will have something slightly different to say, because their personal perspective of the matter is a little bit different, or where they were standing from is different, so, like, their opinions of things will be different. So once I got through this hurdle, it was smooth reading. It was easy to read. I was able to enjoy it, and by the time I got to the end, I was, like, absolutely wowed. I was like, okay, this was great, because I have developed my own opinion on Hercules as a character, and the impact that he had on other people's lives. There's some perspectives I really appreciated, others that I could have just left behind. But by the end of it, I was like, okay, this was a really interesting way to tell somebody's entire life story through the lens of all the people that they encountered. So at the end of this, I was like, absolutely love this book. It was fantastic. Highly enjoyed. I would recommend it. I would, in fact, give it 11 liars out of question mark. It doesn't really matter. I really enjoyed the story. I found it to be a really fun and easy read, which is another thing. Being able to easily digest the information was one of those things. My criticisms of it would be that first part is really hard to get through because it is a little mean-spirited after setting up somebody who's you're like led to believe will have challenges in their life because of the way that they approach things, because they're looking at things from a different lens than most people are, and then to have it immediately like sort of the rug pulled out from underneath you and been like, oh, he's actually an asshole the whole time, is a hard read. It's a hard way to get into it, and it takes a little bit of time before you're able to like walk back that initial perspective and be like, okay, yeah, actually maybe that's just one person's very intense reaction while these other people are giving more sympathetic or understanding reactions, or just sort of brushing it off, because some people do just brush it off in the story. Like, his actions get brushed aside for the people who hero worship him, and then for the people who don't, they're like, absolutely not, we're not looking past this point, which is very fair and very true to how people would react in reality, right? And then the other criticism I have is just the use of the name Hercules, because Hercules is the Greek name for Heracles in Greek mythology. He's named after Hera. In like trying to appease her, they name him Heracles, and that comes up in the story as well. But the story is like contrive sort of a reason for why they call him Hercules instead of Heracles, and it's because he doesn't like to be called Heracles, and he doesn't want to bring up Hera's name, so to avoid getting her attention and her ire, they just call him Hercules instead, which is fine for the story, but like as a person who knows why there's a distinct difference between the two, it drove me insane. And I also just feel like part of the reason was so that they could have the cover say Herc, like, which is fine, but like that's just like such a weird little itty bitty nitty gritty like nitpick that doesn't really matter. It has no bearing on the story whatsoever. It doesn't interfere with my enjoyment of the story. Cause I still really enjoyed the book regardless, but I was like, every time it came up. So like that's a thing. And now I'm going to jump a little bit into spoilers. I have been told that my reviews of these books are too long, so I'm going to try to squidge it up and not recount the entire story for you guys, because that seems to be the problem, is that I start telling you guys the entire story of the book so you don't have to read it yourself, which is not doing you a service. But I'm going to try to shrink and condense this review a little bit so it's not such a long watch, and then just keep most of the discussion in the book club chat. So if you're interested in just joining the chat, if you've read this book already and you didn't read it with the book club, like you didn't read it last month but you've read it before, you can still join the book club chat and join us over there and talk about it. If you're just interested in hearing more about the book, join the book club. Read another book next month, talk about this book this month, ask questions, those sort of things. It's totally open. Like I said, it's an open book club. There's no stress, there's no pressure. If you read one month, you do not have to read the next month. So like, it's out there. Just another resource community tool you can have. Because I'm using it, so why not share? So that being said, we're now in spoilers. The incident in the beginning of the book is the first major incident that Hercules has to atone for. And if you're not familiar with the Hercules myth, his life is a series of like huge events and things he has to atone for. So like huge like Herculean events, heroic events, and things he has to atone for. And it's an interesting story to me. It's actually one of my favorite Greek myths, is like the Heracles myth entirely, because it's this epic hero's journey centered around the idea of redemption and redeeming yourself for past actions so that you can continue to move forward with like a clean slate, to continue to be a hero. And his whole drive is to be a hero. He actually gets offered the option, which doesn't come up in the book, but in the Heracles myth, it comes up that he gets offered the option. He meets basically with like the goddesses of like heroism and the goddesses of pleasure, and they tell him like, you can have a life of like contentment and pleasure and satisfaction, a slow life where you live very well and very happily, but you don't achieve anything and no one will remember your name, but you live a perfectly content, perfectly happy, perfectly satiated life. Or you can live a very hard life with a lot of like trials and tribulations, a lot of struggles, a lot of constant battles, but by the end of it, your name will go down as history as like the greatest hero of all time, and you will be remembered forever. Your name will basically be immortal. You'll be immortal. And as a young man, he has to choose, and he chooses to go the hard life path of heroic immortality. And I was sad that that didn't come up in this story. Like, I wish that there was a moment for it, because interestingly enough, in this story of the Greek myths that we have read so far this year, this story and Atalanta and Psyche and Eros all have very strong working relationships with the gods, where they're not just background characters or like religious concepts that don't actually have personification. This story had a very strong, probably the strongest next to Psyche and Eros, because she's literally talking to a god the entire book, so how can you remove it from there? But it had like a very strong relationship with the gods and how they interacted directly with his story, with mankind, those sort of things. So I expected, because the gods were such a presence in the story, that that moment would show up where you see him consciously choosing to be a hero, but it's not in the story. So I was a little sad to not see that in there. But I feel like maybe they made up for it in the story by just sort of making it that he chose to be a hero. It's very obvious that he chooses to be a hero, because as the story goes on, you see moments in the story where people will say something like, surprisingly, Hercules was very smart, or very well-spoken, or very intelligent about something, or very crafty, but they would then follow that up by saying, but he would downplay it himself, or pretend like that wasn't the case himself. So he chose to sort of underplay his intelligence, his entire cognitive ability. He chose to portray himself as a big dumb idiot, for the most part, who just had a hard time with like social situations and emotions, because he wanted to be remembered for being a very strong, powerful hero, as opposed to being a smart person or an intelligent creature or an emotional creature. He wanted to be remembered as a hero, which I thought was very interesting, because he makes that conscious choice a lot throughout the story. A lot of times just in regular conversations where people might bring up that they think he's attractive, and he's like, actually, no, I'm just a bunch of muscles. And like when people would bring up his accomplishments, he would be like, yeah, I'm just muscles, I'm not smart at all, even though he did use his brain to solve some of his problems. In the case of his first labor of fighting the Hydra, he had to conceive to burn the heads of the Hydra to keep them from regenerating. And in the same way of cleaning up the Aegean stables, which were these stables with thousands of horses that were just absolutely full of horse shit, nobody cleaned them out, he diverts an entire river to then wash away all the shit to solve that problem. And that's kind of big brain ideas, right? You need to have some level of intelligence to sort of come up with that, and he does, but he always downplays it. Like, he didn't use his brains to solve this problem, just his huge, glorious muscles. The other thing I thought was really interesting in this story is that they talk about him being short a lot. And not short like in the diminutive sense, but shorter than you would expect somebody with his reputation to be. He had a twin. They were the same height, but he was very broad of shoulder. So that comes up a lot too. Sorry, Inky. That he's a very broad-shouldered man, but shorter than you would expect, because the name of Hercules carries so much weight. It's such a big idea that the story itself has mythological components to the people who were living in the day and age and experiencing that story. So the name of Hercules is larger than life, and when they see him, they're like, surprisingly, he was actually really short. Because you're thinking he's going to be this giant of a man, but he's actually just a very broad-shouldered, very strong, muscular man who might be of average height, but it's shorter than what you believe. And I just thought that was really interesting that that comes up multiple times, is that people are surprised that he's just a regular size guy. And I thought that was a really good touch in the story, a really good bit of characterization, and a really good way to keep him grounded in a way that doesn't make him seem like a mythological character living amongst men. He's a regular guy, and I think the author does a really good job at demonstrating that despite all of the cool, fantastical things he does, some of which he might have just made up to add to his own lore, that's also implied several times. You never know for sure, but a lot of people sort of drop hints that like he might just be padding his story and making it more magical and mystical than it was, which is smart if you're trying to achieve eternal fame and glory, is to sort of add to the narrative, right, and boost your own story by being your own hype manager and sort of making things more spectacular. But I forgot my entire train of thought. Hold on. Okay, I can't really remember. I think it was basically just the point that the author does a really good job of demonstrating that he's a regular person who happens to have achieved like mythological greatness and not a mythological person living a regular life. That comes across really well in this story, and it plays really well. The other thing that I think is really cool about the book is that it sort of walks the line of like demonstrating his various sexuality and his sexual preferences, because for all intents and purposes, Hercules is either bisexual or pansexual, and it doesn't really seem to matter to him what gender is, although you do see in the story he does seem to be a lot more inclined to be kinder and more in love with his male lovers as opposed to his female lovers, but he does eventually find a female lover towards the end in Deianira that's sort of his equal. She's able to match him in a physical sense and an emotional sense, to the point that he seems to have a very genuine care for her, as opposed to sort of treating her like a prize that he won like his other female lovers would have been. I will say, if you are considering reading this book, if you haven't read it already, the depiction of him doing the initial murder of his family, which is said to be like Hera drove him mad and made him kill his first family and all of the children they had. They had like 7 children, and he killed all of them, including the wife. It's a very graphic depiction of it, but also slightly confusing, I will say. And this might have just been like lost in the sauce while I was listening to it, but I had a hard time keeping track of the places that all of the children were, to the point where when we got to the end and they said that was the last kid, I was like, wait, I feel like there are 2 more left, and we just kind of yada-dotted over that, but I may have missed that in the listening and just missed out on where that was. But I feel like when I was listening, we sort of smoothed over a couple of the deaths to get to the final one. But I will say, if that sort of thing upsets you, it's going to upset you. It's not super graphic, but it is pretty explicit what happens to those kids, and it's upsetting, to the point where you're like, there's no coming back from this. But surprisingly, he does, which is really interesting to me, and I think it goes a lot to speak with how the author managed to humanize the character, because not only is he super remorseful over everything that happened, but you feel for the guy, because it does seem genuinely like Hera made him kill his family, and he has all this regret and remorse for it, to the point where he does the 12 labors. That was the reason he took up the 12 labors, was to repent and redeem himself after this atrocious act that is out of his control. And it seems like as the story goes, you then have to decide if it's his rage issues, because his first murder and necessary act of redemption comes from when he murders his music teacher and has to go spend a year herding goats to redeem himself, even though he was absolved of the sin, basically by everybody else around him. His parents held him accountable, specifically his mortal father, not his actual father Zeus, and made him go herd goats for a year. That one seems to be an act that nobody made him do. Like, he chose to kill that guy himself, and it may have just been like a didn't know his own strength, didn't mean to, accidental death kind of issue, because he throws something at him, it hits him in the head, and it kills him. So that just seems to be like the issue there. He gets absolved of his sins, like I said, and they're like, no big deal, but his parents are like, maybe kind of. And the sad thing in that story, in this book, is that his dad is like, he absolutely has to atone for that. Like, he can't just get away scot-free. There has to be a lesson learned from that so that he understands the value of life and how to cherish it and not to just take life casually. But his mom is like, no, not my sweet baby angel boy, until she gets pregnant and has a girl. Like, they have a daughter finally, and then she's like, oh no, he has to go because now I'm actually afraid he might hurt my daughter, which is such a sad, like, turn of the heel for his mom, who had been like his biggest coddler and supporter the entire time, up until she had another child, and then decided that this child was more precious than her sweet baby boy that she had been coddling this entire time. And then she finally was able to see the danger in having a demigod for a son. Like, it was an interesting balance to walk, and he eventually forgives his mom for the situation, but he never forgives his mortal father, like, ever. They never see each other again, because he's so angry at his dad for holding him accountable for this thing that he got absolved from, which is logical to me because he was a teenager when it happened, right? So, like, you tend to be very mad at your parents when stuff like this happens, when they hold you accountable for things or they punish you and you think it's unfair or unjust. He holds on to that anger his entire life. Like, he never lets that go. So you can see that inside of the character of Hercules, there is an anger that's present and an ability to take life, and it's a lot easier for him because he has his demigod strength. So when he ends up killing his family, it leaves you with the question of, was this an act of anger? It's sort of like portrayed in a way where he's like jealous of his children for getting more attention than him, which doesn't ring true to his character for the rest of the book. So I'm more inclined to believe that Hera actually had a finger in this situation. But you never know for sure, because Hera herself isn't a character in the book. So Hera and Zeus don't make actual appearances. It's just sort of like, well, they were here, this happened, Hera was involved, so to speak. Hera does talk to his cousin a little bit, but that's like the most characterization you get for Hera. Is her just being like, I sent him to you so that you could kill him, so kill him with one of the labors. But otherwise, there's not a lot, like, from her perspective. You don't get, like, the godly perspectives in this, which I wish we had. Like, I wish at least, like, by the end, we got, like, a Hera chapter or a Zeus chapter to just be like, here's the wrap-up, here's everything that, like, we were thinking from our perspective. But then I guess, like, also, it would be inherently a little bit egotistical to say from the perspective of the gods. But that's, like, the thing I wish we had in this, because I am dying to get one of those perspective chapters, because all the other perspectives were all from humans, and it was very well done, but, like, there's no godly perspective on this character. And then the next death, after he completes the labors, he accidentally kills his nephew in a foot race. I think that happens first. There's two more deaths after this. So he accidentally kills his nephew, and then it seems to be an accident. His nephew gets a little bit ahead of him. He reaches out to grab him and accidentally throws him over a wall. And then he blames Hera for that as well, and you don't know. It's, again, a question mark. This one's also like a murkier situation than the death of his family, where I'm more inclined to believe Hera did it. This seems like maybe just wasn't prepared for the amount of strength he had, but doesn't know if it was Hera or not. And the same thing happens again when he leaves one city with his male lover to go track down some cows that were stolen, and he accidentally pushes him off a wall too, or punches him, or something. Something happens where he dies. I don't remember specifically how he died. I think it was very similar. In the same city, even. And he has to go redeem himself in that case by living as a slave. When he kills his nephew, he has to go redeem himself by farming for a couple of years. And it's just, it's a very interesting, sad cycle. In all of these cases, he's like, Hera made me do it. I didn't want to. I don't know what happened. We were just running. And then the next thing I know, they're dead. And it's very sad. It's very tragic. It really paints the picture of this sort of tragic hero who accomplishes great things, amazing things. To the point where you're like, wow, this guy's so incredible and so amazing. But his life is so speckled with these small tragedies that are at his own hand, but you don't know if it's actually his will or just, the will of the gods influencing him, that it makes it really tragic, because you're just dealing with a very complex character, and I think that's what I liked the most. By the end of this story, I was left with a very complex narrative surrounding one person with pros and cons on both sides, and then I was left to sort of develop my own opinion on where I stand sympathetically. And like I said, the myth of Heracles is my favorite myth, so by the end of it I was like, yeah, no, I absolutely love this. I'm pro Heracles in every narration of the story. Even his death is sort of tragic, and also not a girl boss moment, because he like I said, he marries Daenerys, who ends up being his emotional, physical, mental, intellectual equal. She understands him in a way that most women wouldn't, because she's not like other girls. I hate to say that, but she is. She likes hunting. She's a strong, independent woman. She's not threatened by his size or his strength or his demeanor. None of those things are a bother for her. She likes that he likes to travel and leave her alone to her own devices, that she doesn't have to compete with him for who's going to be in charge of things, because he's not interested in ruling a kingdom or anything like that. He keeps pursuing princesses in the story, which is interesting to me, because they're, in the way of that time, a prize to be won, and can usually be won by achieving some sort of contest or feat. A lot of these ancient kings would have contests for their daughter's hand, and so he's more interested in winning the contest to then win the prize than he is actually interested in ruling their kingdom. So a lot of these people are left in positions, all of these these princesses are oh yeah, well, I happen to be princess of this country, but I'm married to Hercules, but he doesn't want to rule. So he's no, I just want to keep doing hero shit while having a princess for a bride, which is weird. It's a weird choice for him in particular. But when he meets Daenerys, she's absolutely perfect. You do your hero shit while I do my shit. But she gets to meet him at the end of his life, later in life, when he's in his 40s to his 50s, and she gets to see him from a different perspective than most people, because this is body scarred and pockmarked and ravaged by his years as a hero, ravaged by the plague the gods put on him. And he's immortal, so he's getting older, whether he wants to admit it or not. And in this case, he doesn't want to admit it. He wants to be the peak of his physical game. This is Smokey's tush right here. He wants to be on top of everything, and as big of a hero as he was in his 20s. He wants to accomplish more things, but he doesn't want to admit that he's getting older. He's slowing down. Stuff is affecting him more than it would have before, and she's there with him for the whole time to not only support him and carry him through, but then remind him hey, you're old now, and you have to kind of come to terms with that, whether you want to or not. And he doesn't want to, which I think is a really good aspect, because nobody ever talks about how long all this stuff took. It took him 12 years to accomplish all of his labors, partly because he kept fucking off and fucking around for a big chunk of his time. It might have even taken longer than that. I'm just guessing. I think it's 15 years to accomplish his labors. In the middle of his labors, he decides to go join the Argonauts, and that took a big chunk of time too. And then he comes back to it. So he's very laissez-faire about getting all of these done, even though he wants to be done with them. But it takes him a very long time. So that's a big chunk of your life to just sort of assign to something, and then to do more adventures and stuff after that. All of these things took a very long time. So by the time you get to his story, he is in his 50s, and nobody wants to talk about heroes getting older. So the fact that it comes up in the book was really refreshing, and it was a really good take, and I really liked that perspective to get for Hercules in general and how things go. And I think that's probably one of my favorite aspects of the story. But by the end, Daenerys has a bestie, a friend named Nessus, who is a centaur who gets absolutely friend zoned, and his chapters are so slimy, you guys. They made me go, ugh, so gross, because it's listening to somebody who literally has been friend zoned, who is convinced that they are the one for Daenerys and will have her at any cost. So if he's a good friend to her, eventually she'll be his, which is so icky to read. But it's a real perspective that a lot of guys have, and he just can't accept that he's been friend zoned and he is to be her friend. So he gets shot at by Heracles, because Heracles thinks that he's peeping on them and trying to attack them. And turns out the arrow is tipped in hydra venom, so even though the shot isn't fatal, he's going to die. So with his last act, he uses some like centaur blood magic, calls on Hera for help, and gives Daenerys a shirt for her husband to keep her faithful, because at this time he's trying to make amends for killing his most recent male lover to his sister, who he had once attempted to like win in a challenge, but then they kicked him out. So they were like, hey, you can't actually be in this challenge, and he was really pissed about it. That's when he took his lover. They left to go look for the cows, and then that's how he died. So he comes back after his slavery session is over, after he's remarried to Daenerys, and tries to appease his sister, the sister that got left behind, the girl that he wanted to marry at some point. And Daenerys takes that personally, which is fair, because, you know, your husband is actively sort of low-key courting the girl that he was supposed to marry at one point, and isn't doing the same thing for you, because in his brain, the one girl, Iole, is super fancy princess, like, you know, she's a very girly princess, and then Daenerys is also a princess, but she's a little rough around the edges, a little tomboyish, so she wants different things. So he gives her stuff, like, he sends stuff to Daenerys while he's away that he thinks she'll like, because it has some significance to the two of them, like animal hides, a chariot wheel, just random garbage, essentially. And when he goes to bring stuff to Iole, he's bringing her flowers and fine dresses and things like that, all the way up until the point where Hera takes over his mind and makes him try to conquer the kingdom. And Iole has to, like, jump out of her window in order to escape his attention, so she can eventually come back and retake her kingdom if he does take over. He doesn't take over. He leaves when the madness leaves him and goes back home to his wife. But Nessus makes a shirt out of his blood that he gives to Daenerys and tells her, like, hey, to keep your husband faithful, give him this shirt. I'm your friend. I'm your buddy. And then Nessus fucks off and dies. And the problem is that Daenerys doesn't know that Nessus dies, so she doesn't know that this is like a revenge shirt. So she gives it in her insecurity to Heracles, and he puts it on like she asked him to. And he doesn't put it on until he leaves to go on his next outing to then apologize again for losing his head and trying to take over Iole's kingdom. But he puts it on, and the shirt burns him alive. It, like, is acidic. It sticks to his skin. He can't get it off. It causes him so much pain that he has to rip down trees, build his own funeral pyre, and then jump into it in order to die. And the most, like, awful, tragic way. But Daenerys hears him screaming from miles away and goes out of her way to try to get to him, but by the time she gets there, he's dead. It's already over. She can't save him. There's no saving him. And everybody comes out for his funeral. And I think the other thing that is sad is that, you know, by this point, he's lost most of the people that care about him, but there's still people around there who know him and they know who he is, but nobody shows up to his funeral. It's just his favorite nephew, Aeolus, his wife, and a couple of people in the city, a couple of nobles who show up for his funeral, but nobody else does. So he sort of dies in this really sad, tragic, lonely way, given all of his accomplishments and feats and how grand his life was. His life ends on a, you know, like, on a whimper, and it's such a sad, like, bittersweet way to end such an epic life. And that's how the book ends. It ends with his death, and it stops right there. I will say that knowing that it's just his mortal body that dies, and it's the immortal part that Zeus sort of plucks out of the fire and brings up to Olympus, in the mythology, Hercules lives on. Heracles lives on as an immortal. He ends up getting married to Hebe, the goddess of youth, which is Hera's daughter, so I know that just fucking rubbed her the wrong way for the rest of her life. But he ends up continuing his life, finally getting to rest, finally getting to be at peace in Olympus with his family, and just living a quiet, immortal existence as really, like, the god of heroes, kind of, in that aspect, but not really an official titled god. But that's, like, the reward he gets for having so many trials, so many tribulations, is he doesn't just get, like, his name registered in immortality. He gets to finally have immortality and the peace that, you know, he could have had for his regular mortal life, but chose to eschew in favor of going through this tough battle. So there's no chapter at the end of the book that covers him ascending to godhood, which I would have kind of maybe liked a nod, like, maybe in that godly wrap-up that I kind of wanted. If they just mentioned it like in an offhand way, like now he's up here, it would have been nice. But I think, you know, as far as the book goes, it's a good way to end just on his death and be like, that's the end of the life, like the mortal life of Heracles. It's a decent and fine way to end the story, and I wasn't like mad about it. I just wanted more, you know, I just wanted a little tiny morsel more than what we got. But otherwise, like, I love the book. I think the book was great, and those are all of my thoughts about it. Hopefully this was a little bit more succinct of a review. If you made it to the end of this video, I appreciate your faces. Don't forget that next month we are doing Ariadne with a Smokey's Tail also involved. And that's going to be it for me, you guys. I have run out of things to say here. I will be continuing the conversation in the group chat, so if you're interested in joining that, if you read the book, you can join us there. If you would like to join for next month when we read Ariadne, also join there. All the things, all my contacts and stuff are down below, so if you need to find my handle for Instagram, it's down there in the description box. But that's going to be it for me, guys. I'm going to jump off here. I will catch you all in the next one. I appreciate your faces so gosh darn much, and happy crafting, guys. Bye!